Good afternoon or good morning, and welcome to this new Fleet Forum webinar. My name is Roos van Stijn. I'm the Development Director, and in about 30 minutes, we're gonna talk to you. I'm gonna talk to you about risk management and to explain some of the basic principles when it comes to managing the risks that we are running. I know that there has been a lot of people who signed up for this webinar, so I will wait for a moment to allow everyone to join. I hope if somebody can just let me know in the chat if you can hear me okay, if the audio is okay, that would be very helpful. I see that people are typing. For those of you who have not joined one of our webinars before, super, thanks, Hamdi. So for those of you who have not joined our webinars before, it is always a pleasure to see if people are interactive. So feel free to use the chat box to introduce yourself, to tell us where you're from, but also to comment on some of the principles that we will be discussing or to ask some questions. Now, if you have a question, in the chat box, you see that little icon with a question mark. And if you have a question, just use that question mark, tick that little icon as a question for me. And at the end of the webinar, I will be able to easily identify your questions. So it's going to be 15 minutes of me explaining, talking, providing you with some concepts, and then we have around 15 minutes to do your to answer your questions. Today, later, you will get the recorded version of this webinar. It's always good to know that up front. We will share that with you so then you can watch it at your own leisure. So now that we have done all, let's say, all the logistics messages, let's start. So risk management. I want to discuss this, and I want to discuss this because as a fleet manager, it is important that we realize that by operating a fleet, that we run into risks, right? And I want to use it from an angle of safety and environmental risk. Because, safety when we are traveling with vehicles, when we are participating in traffic, safety is always at the back of, at the front of our head, right, of our thoughts. And environmental risk, and we took that one as well, because environmental commitments and environmental issues and concerns are much more on organizations' agenda currently, and it will be for the next couple of years. So I thought it would be nice to approach it from a safety and environmental perspective. But of course, we can also look at risk from financial perspective or from a security perspective. So there's different angles, but let's take these ones. Okay. So, like I said, looking at risks from a safety and environmental perspective, in some organization that is also part of your HSE policy or your HSE procedures, and H is then for health, safety and environment. Now, maybe in the chat box, if you can sort of let me know what kind of safety risks do you see for your fleet in the country where you operate. Just feel free to type, feel free to give me your suggestions. So why is it important that we consider safety risks? What are situations where we would have a risk, or what could be the consequence of that risk? And I see that people are typing. Take a little bit of tea. And I'll give you a moment. Sometimes it takes a while before it ends up in the chat. So we're really looking at safety risks that you run with your fleet. Let me give it a second. I see that people are still introducing themselves. It's really nice. It's good to see so many people from so many different countries participating in the webinar. Lawrence, thank you very much. Road traffic crashes, yeah. So that I think is a big risk, right? And it can have a lot of consequences. Maybe other risks that you see when it comes to safety. Mines, yeah. So maybe to make it more broadly, in some of the countries where we operate, the operating environment sort of puts a risk to you, right? When you say, okay, well, we have to operate in this area, but we are confronted with AIDs or with mines, so that will be a risk. I see Ebuka, reputational risk. Yeah, I think that reputational risk, it can be sort of a consequence of maybe your road traffic crashes risk, right? So we have a risk on a risk. Because if your organization and you're driving around with your vehicles, with your shiny logos, if your organization is in a lot of crashes, then it can have an impact on the reputation and how your organization is perceived, right? I see, Timothy, preventative risks at workplace in all angles. Oh, that's very broad, but let's see if we can make it more specific. I see Vincent is talking about car hijacking or carjacking, when other people take away your vehicles or your transport assets. That is a risk, of course. So in a couple of minutes, we have already identified some risks that have to do with our safety. Now, I was thinking about it, and of course, yeah, road traffic crashes with casualties, that is a risk for our organization, but also safety in and around the vehicle. And I like what Carl was putting down, is driver well-being. We always also need to think about the vehicle, or the vehicle as a safe workspace for drivers, right? Drivers are spending maybe 8-9 hours in that vehicle, and we need to make sure that they are not running a risk, or that at least we know what types of risk they are facing. So here are a couple of examples, and I like how you are providing more and more examples. Now, looking at the environment, what kind of risks would we see there for our fleet? Oh, yeah, I see, Ladu, the most common one in South Sudan is theft and insecurity. Yeah, so that is a risk as well. The risk that somebody steals your vehicle or your assets. But now, sort of leaving aside safety and security risks, but now more looking at the environment. So what types of risks do you see there for your fleet? I'll give it a couple of... I see that people are starting to type, so there must be a lot of brilliant ideas. Yeah, pollution, Lawrence. Yeah, definitely. So the risk that you are... Oh, that is not even a risk, right? You know, by operating your vehicle, and especially in particular if it is a diesel or a petrol vehicle, that you will contribute to the the environment, or to environmental pollution. So that is a consequence of it. I see passenger risks going to high mountains. Yeah, that's probably a risk. Well, you have to identify what the specific risk is. I see still car ambushes, so more on the security side. Ooh la la, it sort of looks like we have a lot of risks on our hands. Carl, yeah, CO2 emissions, global warming, so yeah. Let me share what I came up with. So as a fleet manager, we would like to contribute to reducing the CO2 emissions and air pollution, right? Air pollution specifically, if you are operating in your local environment, then driving the car that causes air pollution. And of course, we would like to reduce that. As a humanitarian organization, you should not want to make climate matters worse, because in many cases, your organization is doing programs to protect your beneficiaries from the consequences of climate change. So by driving your fleet, you would like to reduce your CO2 emissions as much as possible. And of course, more and more organizations are now pledging to reduce their emissions with 30% by this year or whatever. So you also need to take that into account. So these are sort of the safety and environmental, let's say, reasons why you want to look into these risks and why you want to mitigate them or why you want to avoid them. Now, I think in the last 10 minutes, I have used the word risk a lot of time. But now let's think about, okay, when we say we have a risk, what is it exactly what we mean? What do we mean when we say, oh, we have a risk that we are in a road traffic crash, or we have a risk that we do not provide a safe workspace for drivers? So what is the meaning, or what is the definition, in your opinion, of the word risk? And I see that we already have a nice question. Anytime you are in a road, there is a risk of a crash, theft, and so on. Yeah, injuries, lost asset, insecurity. Yeah, Ebuka, possibility of an event occurring during our operations. Yeah, uncertainty in a situation. Okay, yeah. So if we talk about risk, then I think for me the easiest way to explain it is basically the possibility. So we are not certain. So I like somebody was saying, oh, the uncertainty. So the possibility that something bad is happening. So that is basically what we mean in this sort of regard with the word risk. And I already saw a question around, okay, so what is it that we can do to manage these risks? And I think that what I would like to share with you are, let's say, 4 strategies. So we do have a risk. We have a risk that we are going to be involved in a road traffic crash. We have a risk that we are going to be driving into an ambush, or we have a risk that our car is being hijacked. So all these types of risks. And we have 4 strategies how we can manage that. So the first one is to avoid. And that is basically looking like, okay, do we really need to make this trip? Can we avoid being in that situation at all? Can people work remotely, or can we do things online like we are doing right now? And sort of avoiding also has to do with some of the policies and regulations that either your organizations or the country, the government of the country that you are working in, are putting out. So, for example, in most countries, it is not allowed to drive under the influence of alcohol, right? And by putting up that procedure or that policy or that law, we avoid that we have a risk that we have people on the road who are drunk driving. I'm not saying that it never happens, but at least we are going to reduce the opportunity or reduce the possibility that we are on the road with drunk people. On the environmental side, we see now that more and more governments are putting up legislation, that we are putting up legislation around the types of vehicles that we are allowed to import or to bring into the country. For example, in Kenya, we can only import Euro 3 standard cars. And of course, these vehicles have a lower impact on the environment. So that's sort of avoiding strategy. Then we can reduce or mitigate, another word for reduce. So maybe you say, well, we do accept that there is a risk. We do accept that when operating in this environment, we do know that we run into a risk that something bad happens to us. But I'm going to come up with actions to reduce the negative outcome or the impact on us. So, for example, in an area where you have a lot of pedestrians, maybe a market or a school, where you tell your drivers, even if the country speed limit is 80, where you tell your drivers, I want you to drive 30 here, because I want to reduce the possibility that you are going to be in a situation where you are causing or where you are going to be involved in a crash. The third strategy is to transfer the risk. And when we say transfer the risk, I'm not saying like, oh, I'm gonna hire a subcontractor and now this subcontractor has the risk and this subcontractor is responsible for the risk. No, what I mean with transfer the risk is about, let's say, sharing the risk that that something is going to happen. And a really good example of transferring the risk is the fact that your organizations are taking up insurance in whatever shape or form. But that is transferring the risk because you sort of understand like, oh, something can happen to my vehicle. But when it happens, at least I get a little bit of financial compensation. And by that, you are transferring your risk. And then the last one is accepting the risk. And accepting the risk is where you say, well, we know that we are at risk, but we are accepting it because we feel that we need to do this. But of course, you can still then put some things in place to make sure that when bad things happen to you, that you are you're gonna reduce as much as possible. So accepting the risk is also around, does your organization have put in place self-insurance, for example? You understand that there is a risk that you will be involved in a crash, but you are putting away already money to be prepared for the situation where you have to come up with compensation. So that is about sort of risk management strategies. Now, if you look at basic principles of risk management, then what we would like to do is we first want to identify the risks. And you can do that in many ways. Let me sort of look at that. So you will discuss in your conversations with your drivers, with partners. So in your operation, what are the risks that are out there that I need to either accept, avoid, mitigate, or transfer? And it's not only looking at what happens in your own organization, but a really good way is also to look outside of your organization, because you might not have been presented with that risk, but maybe you've heard of other organizations operating in the same environment. And then if you have heard of that, and if you heard of it multiple times, then you can sort of say, ooh, well, then it might be a risk for my organization as well. So identify the risks, and I really would encourage you to do that at least at an annual basis, because sometimes you might think that now you have something has a low risk, but it can sort of evolve over time, right? So do that at least once a year. Now that we have identified the risks, you want to analyze the risk. And that goes back to how often will this happen, or how often do we think it's going to happen? And if it happens, what is the worst that it could turn out into? So we will look at frequency and severity. And I hope that makes sense. And you can plot that on a simple, well, like you see on the screen, you can plot that where you say, okay, it happens a lot, but the impact is really low. So the severity is really low. Then you plot it at high frequency, low severity. Or you say, well, it doesn't happen a lot, but when it happens, then it has a huge impact. Then you plot it on the sort of on the more writer's part of the scale. And by doing that, you make it visible as well. And it's really easy to see then where you should put your energy to mitigate these risks, or to transfer them or to avoid them. And then the last one is to look into risk control. And Risk control is where we are looking into how can we neutralize or reduce our identified risk. And what you see here in this pyramid is, of course, elimination will be the most effective form of control, whereas what you see in the top, the least effective is to protect the worker with personal protective equipment. That is not to say that if you have people using motorbikes, of course you would want to give them a helmet and a reflective jacket and all that stuff, because that's, at least it is part of your control, right? But the better option is to eliminate the need for driving on a motorcycle, and I hope that makes it clear. I see that somebody says there is no sound. Can somebody else confirm if you can still hear me? Otherwise, oh, I see a lot of people now, so I'm assuming that you can hear me. Okie doke. So that is about the risk identification, the risk. Let me go back to that slide. The risk identification, the risk analysis, and the risk control, right? And these are important steps. And you should, like I said, plan it, do the risk identification, and that whole exercise about, okay, what are the risks? How do we analyze them? Low severity, high severity, low frequency, high frequency. And then what types of control can we put in place? And then the best type of control is always the elimination of elimination or substitution of your risk control, of your risk. Last but not least, on our knowledge platform, we do have tools that you can use. And we will send in the email that we send at the end later today, we will also give you an example of a risk management tool, so you can look into that. But there is a variety of tools out there. I think in a lot of organizations, they use the risk register, where you classify the risk and where you then come up with actions, and where organizations do follow whether the mitigation action is really influencing the risk that you have. So the risk register is a good one. Brainstorming, work with people in your organization, outside your organization, to identify all the types of risks that you face, and then start classifying them. And you can sort of classify them with using probability and impact matrices. And that goes back to what we were saying before around, okay, how often does it happen? And if it happens, what is the impact? Now, another one that is really good, and especially if you are looking into safety and security risks, and is to do some root cause analysis. When you have identified the risk, then try to sort of work your way backwards. What are the causes of these risks? And you can do that by asking why a lot of times. So, we have a risk of road traffic crashes. So why is that? And then you can sort of, by asking a lot of the time the question why, you can sort of work your way back to see, okay, how can we eliminate that, or how can we mitigate that, or if not, do we accept it? So these are a couple of risk management tools. I see that I have been talking for far too long. Let me see if there are questions before we. Let me see, and feel free to still type your question if you have them. What are the risk management strategies? So yeah, we did that one, right? We said avoid the risk is a strategy, reducing or mitigating is a strategy, transferring your risk, and then last but not least, accepting your risks. That's all. These are all types of strategies that you can put in place. Let me see. Lawrence, I see, kindly share the slides if possible. More than happy to add those to the webinar. Might be easy for you to look at it. I will do that. Any other questions from your side? Let me see if maybe I'm looking. I see that somebody is typing. So yeah, it is, maybe I haven't stressed that enough, but it is important as a fleet manager to look at your risks, right? More and more what we do see is that risk management, risk control, risk mitigation is an important part of the job of a fleet manager. And I think the tricky thing with risks is that you always need to be expecting the unexpected. And whenever you start looking into your risks and whenever you start doing these exercises, try to maybe in your brainstorming phase where you say, well, no, that is never going to happen, right? But don't exclude too easy risks. Rather start with a long list. And then when you start classifying them on, okay, well, how likely is it that this will happen? Or what is the impact? Then put some weight on it. But at the start, really try to create a big list, and it's easier to get them off the list than if you are too sort of too narrow in your thinking of risks. I see that still some people are typing, so maybe we have. Okay, so Lawrence, yeah, take home risk management strategy, avoid, prevent, transfer of accept. Okay, super. If there are no more questions, then what I would like to say as the end is thanks a lot for being there, being here at the webinar. I hope that you got some insight into risks and how you can deal with that. Next week we will not have a webinar, but the week after we will. And then what we would look into is into your fleet acquisition plan. So I hope to see you then. And for those of you who are still sort of in the middle of the day, enjoy the rest of your day. And hope to see you soon another time. Thanks a lot.